Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Today is Friday. We are starting the weekend, and as we start the weekend, we have to look forward to Sunday, which will be the 8th of May. What happens on the 8th of May? The 8th of May is going to be the 2-month anniversary of the release of Sepulcher. That's right, the raid has been out for 2 months. So, to celebrate the release of the raid, we're going to go back, we're going to take a step back and compare how the raid has gone with the previous raids of Shadowlands. We have done this before, we have looked at how many more players or less players are joining the raids in heroic difficulty, in mythic difficulty, to see the engagement of players in the raid activity. So after a solid 2 months, I thought it was enough of a check mark to be able to go and see how things have progressed. It's gonna be an interesting look, because this tier, we have pointed this out before, looked very hard from the start. Remember, this tier immediately set off to be very weird because guilds basically didn't enter Mythic for 10 days, even after it was available. You know, it was the first tier where the tuning seemed so rough, even in heroic, that guilds basically didn't even bother trying to get any progress in Mythic. That was a first in many expansions where this happened. And then even after getting into Mythic, even after starting the progress in Mythic, we saw some very tough hurdles, because Alondrus proved to be a massive block for guilds. And even after Alondrus, it's not that the way was paved to a free cutting edge, because after Alondrus you had Anduin, which was also similarly difficult. So it's gonna be interesting to see just how much of a difference there is compared to the previous tier, compared to Sanctum of Domination. So looking at heroic first. Okay, we're starting with heroic, and just to see the first boss. Okay, so just literally entering and getting the first free kill of the Loot Piñata, that is the first boss. The Taragru, after 2 months of Sanctum, had 17,500 guilds defeating it, while Vigilant Guardian had 11,800. So we already get a pretty significant gap right from the first boss, you know, right from the freebie of the raid. The gap remains somewhat stable even after we go a few bosses in, when you compare the 9 in Sanctum and Dosen in Sepulcher. It's 16,500 to 10,600. The gap slightly reduces midway through the raid, because if you compare Soul Render Dormazen with Pantheon, Prototype Pantheon, there were 13,600 guilds for Sanctum of Domination versus the 9,600 guilds of Sepulcher. Then we have the hurdle of the raid, the first big hurdles of the 2 raids, Painsmith and Alondrus. So Painsmith in heroic of Sanctum after the first 2 months was being cleared by 12,400 guilds, while Alondrus in these first 2 months of Sepulcher was being defeated by 8,800 guilds. So this gap, which is slightly more than half of the player base compared to Sanctum, seems to be consistent. The consistency drops a little bit more, which might be a hint of what happens in Mythic, when we look at the last boss, Sylvanas versus the Jailer. Sylvanas had 5,400 guilds, getting ahead of the curve after 2 months, while the Jailer has 2,000 guilds, getting ahead of the curve 2 months into the tier. So in heroic, we already see a pretty significant gap, reduction of participation compared to the previous tier. Is there going to be a difference in Mythic, or is it going to follow the same curve? If you remember, by the way, the last time we checked these type of numbers, we saw that heroic was dropping in player base in numbers, but Mythic was actually increasing. There was actually more participation in Mythic, so perhaps this is going to follow the same trend. Again, starting from the first boss, the first freebie of the raid, Taragru versus Vigilant Guardian. Taragru, 2 months into Sanctum, had 6,800 kills, while Guardian, 2 months into Sepulcher of the first one, has 3,400 guilds. So they make it easy for us. It's basically half as much. It's basically a 50% reduction between the 2 tiers. The 50%-ish reduction continues because a little bit further down the raid progression you have the 9 and Dosen, and once again the difference is 4,800 to 2,400. So we are staying more or less at the same trend of progression. And this same trend, surprisingly, gets a little bit more of an advantage for the Sepulcher progression, because between Soul Render and Prototype Pantheon, 2,500 were the guilds in Sanctum that cleared Soul Render after 2 months, while 1,600 are the guilds that cleared Pantheon after 2 months. So interestingly enough, deeper down in the harder bosses, the gap seems to be closing. This trend continues once we go back to the cockblock of the raid, Painsmith versus Halondrus. 2 months in Sanctum, 1,400 guilds defeated Painsmith, while 2 months in, 840 guilds defeated Halondrus. So the gap has slightly narrowed down as we go deeper and deeper into the harder bosses as far as the difference in participation between the two tiers. However, we have quite a drastic shift when we look at the last boss, because Sylvanas. So 2 months into Sanctum of Domination, there were 430 guilds that got cutting edge. 2 months into Sepulcher of the first ones, there are 85 guilds that defeated the Jailer and got their cutting edge. So we have seen a somewhat stable and consistent trend between all of the bosses, except when we get to the last one, where the Jailer is 505% less defeated than Sylvanas. So it's quite an outlier, if I say so myself. You could find a random assortment of excuses, like, Sepulcher has one extra boss, Sepulcher has harder bosses towards the end. In Sanctum, after you get rid of Painsmith, you had Guardian of the First Ones and Kel'Thuzad, which were jokes, so it was much easier for guilds to get to Sylvanas, while here, even if you get past Halondrus, you still have to sweat your way through Anduin, Rygallon, and Lords of Dread before you even get to reach the Jailer. So perhaps that's why, or perhaps it's simply the difficulty. However, we have to talk about the other point, which is perhaps there are simply fewer players playing the game, right? Maybe this has nothing to do with the difficulty of the raid. Maybe this has nothing to do with other excuses you might give as to why there are less players. For example, like perhaps with the Valor upgrades coming in and being able to get 272 pieces from Mythic Plus as well, there is less of an incentive to go into the raid, perhaps thanks to the Creation Catalyst and thanks to the tier set dropping from the vault. There is less of an incentive, you are less forced to get into the raid, to get your top gear. Maybe it's nothing like that. Maybe it just has to do with fewer players being in the game, right? That would be a pretty logical explanation. It doesn't explain still the gap that the Jailer has with Sylvanas in terms of progression. That is more likely to do with the other reasons, but for the whole of the raid, looking at Heroic as well, the lower difficulty, and then Mythic, you see that there is a 50 to 40% less participation in the raid compared to the previous tier. What is surprising, because if we were to say, okay, you know what, this difference is because there are less players. That's it. Just stop trying to find other possible clues as to why. It's just that there is less of a player base active. What makes this a little bit more confusing is Mythic Plus, because Mythic Plus you can also see how more or less things have been going based on the amount of players completing keys, right? So what was interesting about Mythic Plus is that when you look at the characters, the unique characters that cleared keys in Season 2, you had 4.6 million unique characters. Meanwhile, in Season 3, up to now, you had 2.5 million. Now, you might be saying, see, that's much less. However, Season 3, this season, is only 65 days long, while the numbers for Season 2 were 230 days long. If we try to shrink this a little bit more, for example, only looking at the number of players after patch 9.1.5 launched. So, if your memory sucks, 9.1.5 is the patch that gave you the ability to respec and rechange covenants without any penalties whatsoever, right? It was the QOL patch that came in a few months into Sanctum of Domination. In that patch, you had 2.4 million unique characters, and that patch lasted for 110 days. 2 months more, almost 2 months more than Season 3 right now. So, you know, even the option that there are less players active and less players in the game overall doesn't make as much sense when you go back and look at the Mythic Plus participation, which is still quite healthy compared to the numbers that we have seen in Season 2 anyways. So, you know, it's quite interesting to see the changes in popularity, to see the change in the progression of the raid compared to last tier. As I said, obviously, because of such a massive difference in kills between Sylvanas and the Jailer, that must not be just about the lower player base, right? It's peculiar. As I said, there might be some reasons here and there as to why exactly less players are joining the raid that don't have to do with just quitting the game, but other reasons that don't make the raid as required to be cleared by players. Anyways, that being said, this is the current situation this first 2 months of Sepulcher. So we will see eventually in the next few weeks how things are going to progress in the raid. We have just seen, after all, quite a few nerfs to the raid, not just to Halonjus, but to Anduin as well. The Jailer has been nerfed as well, so perhaps, as it normally happens, as we go deeper into the tier and more nerfs come through and more guilds get more item level and power, etc., we might see these numbers stretching out a little bit more compared to the numbers of Sanctum, of course, except for the numbers of the Jailer. Those cannot really be explained by the lowering of the player base to be that much smaller than the Sylvanas kills. So that probably has to do with other problems with the Jailer, and even what comes before the Jailer that makes it hard to reach the last boss. So for now, this was our review of the first 2 months of the Sepulcher of the First One's raid compared to our last tier of Sanctum of Domination. I'll let you guys draw your own conclusions, how you like this raid, if you like it more than the previous one. Perhaps you like it more because it's harder, perhaps you like it less because it's harder, perhaps you like it more because of the tier set and how it's much easier now and less RNG heavy to get your tier set thanks to the Creation Catalyst compared to Sanctum's RNG-ness with shards and shard gear. So I'll leave it up to you. For now, I'm going to leave you. I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Friday and the start of your weekend. Thank you guys again for watching the video and for helping to grow and support the channel. You can contribute, as always, more by liking and commenting on the video as YouTube wants, as well as subscribing to the channel. No restrictions for today. Is the weekend. I'm gonna let you all come in and subscribe. Thank you guys again. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I don't like it when it's cloudy. Okay, either you rain or you don't. If you don't rain, please, clouds, just go away. Okay, you're useless if you're not raining.